Hello, I'm Krista McAllister, and welcome to Cerius Leadership. Whether you are growing your business, growing your career, or possibly both, thank you for listening. And I'm joined today by Yoav Ziv, who is a transformative technology business executive and author. Yoav, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Kristen. Great to be here.
And I'm excited to get into a number of different points in your career because you've gone from being a technology programmer up to being an executive to any number of speaking, writing your book, et cetera. So we have a lot to get into today. I want to kick it off with really looking at, we've got a lot going on, especially coming from someone who really does transformative technology projects. We're involved in a very fast-paced environment right now that seems as though it's constantly evolving. When we look at measuring a team's success, isn't just about the scoreboard anymore or about the individual talents of its team members, but at how well they work together. How do they function as a cohesive team? And I know you've dedicated really a significant portion of your career to understanding and enhancing team performance. What has been your secret to really creating successful teams?
That's a great question, Kristen. And obviously there are many things in building a team, but I think if you ask me what is like the guiding principle that I developed over the years. I'm not sure that I had it in the beginning, but over the years, yeah, I was very fortunate to work for fantastic companies and work with some amazing leaders and people that were surrounding me. And one thing that worked for me really, really well is that I fundamentally believe in people. I think that people are decent in their core. I know many people might not agree with me, but I am 100% convinced that this is true. And so whenever I come to a new team or when I establish a team, I've done both. I established teams and I also took over teams.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you will always have those people that don't fit what you're trying to achieve. But for the most part, people are, they are good, especially in the high-tech industry. But I think in many industries, people that come to work, they want to succeed. And therefore, my first glance at the team is asking, what in the architecture of the team make good people not be able to excel if they're not. And then I am busy working with the team to find out where are the challenges, where are the constraints. Now, when people see that, they identify that you are not coming to discipline them, you are not coming to monitor them, you are coming as their servant to help them excel their performance. Everyone wants to succeed. Everyone wants to succeed. And when people see that you work together with them to build a better reality, by the way, when performance improves, everyone enjoys. Not only the company, also the people. The work is nicer, there are less tensions, it's friendlier, and everyone likes success. And I think over time, this architecture exercise, I call it building the big blocks, right? So I first build the blocks that will allow the team, it's almost like an architecture project, engineering project. And then when people are participating in it and they are part of the solution, they get into into doing how we design it together. And then people get engaged and they get involved and they do what we intend them to do, right? And so people start to follow the idea. And that over time creates a lot of loyalty and a lot of fun working together.
It seems so simple in theory. It's the practice part that I really want to dig into. And I know that is part of your secret sauce. And yes, we want to make sure that everyone fits the team. Pardon me. We want to make sure that they're all in the right spots and we want to engage them in that process. that's not just clicking a button. And I'm really hoping you have some stories or examples to where you walked in and what's causing that mismatch? Are they in the wrong position? Do they not have the right skills? Or do they not match there's got to be any number of things that you're going through to get the right fit, to get the team working together.
Yeah, but before that, maybe let's delve on the point of the fact that people are good, because not only good in the sense that they are capable, but they're also decent. I think it's a fundamental foundation in this whole line of thought. And many people would come and their immediate desire would be to replace some team members. And that sometimes is needed. That's fine. It's not that 100 of the people are capable, 100% and 100% of the people are decent and they want to succeed, etc. But what I claim is for the most part, that's the case. I have two pivotal moments in my career that actually proved that point for me. The first point, and then we can talk about how do you architect the team. But first of all, we have to establish that people are good, right? Because that people is not the problem. People are not the problem. And I would like to tell you about two pivotal moments in my career. When I was a mid-level manager, I had about 100 people in my team. And I was responsible for the deployment and delivery of a certain product. And I couldn't stand the head of sales of that product. I mean, he would promise things that I cannot deliver. He would promise features that don't exist, all of that, right?
Yep.
And I used to shout at him. I used to be so angry. And I remember writing emails, pounding on the keyboard, like shouting through the keyboard, right? And one day he walks into my office and he says, Yoav, why are you angry at me? What's the problem here? And I gave him a piece of my mind. You are doing this and you are doing that. And yeah, I was maybe 32, right? Like a few years of career. And he then started saying, yeah, but let me tell you why I do that. And let me explain to you my constraints. And then I explained to him my constraints. We ended up talking for 2 hours. And then I figured out that he's actually a decent person trying to do a good job. And the problem was that we did not talk. We did not have the basic mechanism to share our constraints, find the common ground, solve issues. We just fought, right? And so that's when I learned that people are fundamentally decent. Even this villain that I was so angry at, he was actually trying to do a good job. That's where the coin dropped, that people tend to think that the other teams are not good. And that's probably not true, because if you ask each team, they will tell you that their team is good. It's just the other team that is not good. Right? And so if everyone is saying that, it can't be that everyone is wrong. So that was one moment. The other moment was a few years later. I was already a vice president. I had 1,000 people. I was part of a 5,000 people organization. And, the software industry was maturing. And so customers started to demand faster, cheaper, in higher quality software projects, and we just couldn't do it. And the immediate instinct of the executives, my peers, was to blame the programmers. When we were programmers, we were better because the company was smaller and we cared more than what the programmers do today. And so we spent about 2 years trying to educate and monitor and measure the individual programmers, and nothing happened. And I was very fortunate that my executive VP, the guy that owned the whole organization, said eventually, you know what, guys, we got it wrong. I don't think it's the people. I think it's the way we work. And then we started implementing synchronization mechanisms, which we can talk about later. And the results were immediate and phenomenal. Phenomenal in like $100 million saving a year. That's where the magnitude of the results. And that showed me that people tend to blame the other, not only horizontally, but also vertically. Because in a large organization, sometimes the executives are so far away from the employees that they don't know them. So the people that you don't know, you tend to blame them, right? And so, and the reality was that the people were good. It's just that the synchronization was bad. The environment was bad. So we needed to change the environment.
I've got to stop you there. You made such an interesting comment there, and I want to make sure I'm getting it right. Read, it's not the people, it's the way we work. So going off of that fundamental basis of your first place you're going to go to figure out the issue, it's not the people. We're going on the premise that the people are good. That's not where the issue is. It's the way we work.
Exactly. And not
I
only
want to
that,
know more about that.
yeah.
Please.
So it's not only that people are decent, that they actually want to succeed. I also claim that if you take the atomic tasks of each individual person, it's not that difficult. Yeah, you have, the 20% of the work that you need to do requires real expertise. But in most cases, I'm talking about large organizations or medium to large organizations. In a startup, it can be different. Every person is very unique. But if you have 50, 100, 500 people, you need to have 5, 10, 15% of excellent people. And if you don't have them, get them. But the rest of the work is relatively technical, right? So if the people are good and the tasks are not super complicated, so what's going on here, right? The problem is, like you said in your opening, is when a lot of tasks and a lot of people need to work together. Then even simple tasks done by good people are not working well. And we can start kind of going through the main challenges that exist in such environments and how to, simple ways to overcome those challenges.
I'm very curious from your perspective, having been in larger organizations as well as some smaller ones, do you see those common challenges? Do you see a variance? Or are they pretty much the same fundamentals?
It's the same fundamentals. It's the same fundamentals, but the intensity grows.
I
right?
can see that.
So the larger the organization is, the more intense synchronization problems you will have. And it's just natural, right? You can even take a simple example of just a software project, a construction project. The larger the project is, the more difficult it is to coordinate everyone, right? The more chances of local agendas or local desires or local priorities. The chances that there will be communication gaps increase when the organization grows. So the fundamental issues are the same. They are exactly the same. But the intensity of the problem grows with the complexity of the organization, of the project, and whatever you're trying to achieve. Okay?
I can see that. And something just clicked. When you look at growing an organization, if I'm doing 5 different tasks, it's real easy to keep those, as you say, synchronized. However, if I have someone else now being trained on 2 of those tasks and I'm keeping 3 of them, I run into issues on day 1. And it's not necessarily you're saying me or that other individual. I now have to keep that synchronized.
Exactly.
So when you look at some of the problems, I do want to start there. You'd mentioned some of the most common problems in organizations. Let's level set this. We've all got some of the same problems. What are the common ones that you see?
So I think we can talk about 3 groups of problems. The first group I call the mechanical problem. And that's about how do teams operate. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you a few examples, and I always like to give a practical example that everyone knows about an environment. So I typically choose, I don't know, a hospital, right? And by the way, it's very interesting to see that not only that the size doesn't matter in the core problems, also the industry and the environment, it's all the same. So let's take a hospital as an example. Let's say that you are going to the ER and you need an X-ray. Okay, so right there, problem number 1 emerges, and that's dependencies. The ER, they want to release you from the hospital as soon as possible. They want to get you better, but they want to get you out of the
Mhm.
hospital as soon as possible. The X-ray team might have a different, desire to optimize the cost of the X-ray machines. Now, the fact that there is dependency between the ER and the X-ray to complete the session, your time in the hospital, potentially creates a problem. Why? Because if I am the ER doctor and I now need to wait for the X-ray team to complete your X-ray, then if they're not fast enough, I'm just going to wait, right? And it's the same thing with the software project. The team A depends on team B. It's the same thing in a construction project. It's the same thing in a manufacturing facility. One part is required from one machine to the other. It's all the same. Now, the way to overcome that is to decouple the dependency. So, for example, in the ER and the X-ray example, and by the way, hospitals are extremely efficient operations, right? So they have sold it way before the software industry, the software development industry. But what they do is they create a separate queue for the X-ray. So what the ER doesn't wait for the X-ray; they dispatch you to the X-ray, and once they did that, they continue on with their own thing. And only when you are dispatched back, then the interface connects back. The entire time that you are in the X-ray unit, the ER doesn't care, right? The same thing in software development. How do you decouple software? How do you decouple the dependencies in software? It's called microservices software development. A microservice is a micro application that is independent, and it has a contract with its environment, but it's not dependent on the other components that are being developed. So the microservice architecture came to decouple the dependencies. There are endless examples of solutions. The common theme of all of them is that you identify when is there weight because of dependency, and then you decouple the dependency. All right, so that's number one, dependency.
So if each of these dependencies are uncoupled, when it goes from me to the next person, I'm not sitting there waiting for it. I can go on to the next thing. Exactly. And the person before me isn't waiting until I can get to the next thing because I'm decoupled from it. So we each have our own queue, and we're almost, I think of Animal Crossing, a video game of, we're able to shift and zig and zag as needed, independent of the other, and no one's sitting around waiting. Am I getting that correct?
That you have a longer processing time doesn't impact the other, the dependent. I'll give you just a very, very small example that, again, I'm sure that you have faced. Have you ever been in an aircraft sitting on the ground and there is a problem and a part is required? Like someone needs to go fix something on the airplane.
Miserably so, absolutely.
Exactly. So now there is a dependency between you or the aircraft or whoever is on the aircraft and the part manufacturer or the part supplier. How do you solve that? You maintain a small buffer of parts in the airport so that whatever part is needed, it will be immediately available, and then someone else is going to get and replenish the part tomorrow, not right now. So you decouple the dependency between the airplane and the part manufacturer. It took a long time for people to come up with those things. And you have to come up with those answers again and again in different environments. But at the end of the day, it's all the same. You identify the dependency, and then you say, how do I decouple it?
As obvious as those seem, it's because someone figured them out at one point because they weren't that way prior.
Yes, it is true. It is true. By the way, a lot of that came from manufacturing. It's interesting that we in the high-tech industry in the 90s and early 2000, we looked down on manufacturing. For us, it was like the old school. It took the software industry 30 or 40 years to realize that the manufacturing industry is way more advanced.
Yeah.
than software development, and to start adopting mechanisms from manufacturing into the software development world. That's how Agile got introduced, and then DevOps. It's all manufacturing. And it's just the manufacturing has been around for 100 more years, right? So they solved the problem even before we started.
I did it. Even before you came across the problem. That's awesome.
Exactly.
Now you mentioned there's three groups of problems. We discussed one, mechanical.
So the first one is mechanical, and it has dependencies, it has priorities that need to be aligned, it has goals that need to be aligned, right? That's one family of causes of this synchronization and ways to solve them. The other family is the structures. Okay, the structure in many organizations, there is a matrix, and the matrix is evil because it has an inherent conflicts of interest, inherent. Now, I wouldn't throw away the matrix, but because it has its own benefits. You cannot get resource flexibility without matrix. You cannot have professional guilds or practices without matrix. But the matrix create problems. Now, I want to share with you a personal story of how I overcame that a massive matrix issue. And I think from that, both the problem will be clear and what I recommend to do. So when one of my most senior roles was a division president of, I owned the P&L, and I managed a division that served a very, very large telecom company. And I came in a very, very tough period. We couldn't deliver anything. The customer was very frustrated. It was very hard. And I started asking, like, who owns the delivery? And everyone said the program manager. So I talked to the program manager and I said, what do you own? What do you do when there is a problem? He said, no, I'm only monitoring because the development is owned by this team, and the testing is owned by this team, and design is owned by this team, and you get the picture, right?
Yep.
And eventually, I realized that there were 7-8 layers of different practices that were involved in the project. Each one of them, potentially had a plan that was synchronized, but it actually never worked because reality doesn't comply to your plans. And the program manager, all they could do is shout, hey, you are not doing it. Yes, but I can't, but you promised, but right? And so what I did is that I said I was already senior enough to come and say, we are ignoring the company structure. We are ignoring the company structure completely. And we are creating virtual teams that are feature-based or application-based. And the program manager, for the context of this activity, is the boss. Everyone reports to the program manager for the context of this program. And then above this, the program managers, I had the master program manager, and the results were phenomenal. Now, you see that every day, again in a hospital. If you go to a surgery, the nurses come from one unit, the doctors come from another unit, right? But there is one guy for the duration of the surgery that is setting the rules. Now, he needs to go to work within certain guidelines, right? But at the time of operation, he's the manager. Also in an airplane, the flight attendants, they don't even know the pilot in most cases. They have different unions. Sometimes they may even come from different companies. But the moment they're on an airplane, getting the airplane from A to B, they form a virtual structure with very clear alignment between the authority and the accountability. And so the main thing here is that matrices tend to create confusion between authority and accountability. Everyone is accountable and everyone is responsible. No. You want to overcome that by creating virtual structures that have very clear alignment between the authority of the person and the accountability that they have.
So by doing the virtual structure, we'll say project-based team, one person is able to own it from beginning to end and do the air traffic control in between. There's got to be I imagine there's got to be some basis of SOP or culture. What are the elements that do need to be aligned and everyone's working off of the same playbook? Because I think about nurses and ER doctors, the largest industry for interim, meaning people are stepping in for a period of time and stepping out, is nurses and doctors, particularly in ER, life and death situations. But they're able to step into an unfamiliar environment, work as a team, and then step out.
Yes.
What are those elements that when you're creating those virtual structures or temporary teams, those will work as long as there's some similar operating SOP or some similar basis? What would those be to be able to make sure that they work?
So that's a great question. It varies on the standardization of the work. The more standard the work needs to be, the more you have to have strong practices. So a typical matrix will be built in with a horizontal structure that is the practice or the guild, or this will be all the nurses, all the developers, all the whatever. And then you have a vertical structure would be the task. That this would be the surgeons. They also have they are also a guild or a practice, but they typically are task oriented, right? And or the project managers or the account managers. And so there are practice managers that are responsible for setting the ground rules of how does an S work, right? How does a developer work? What is the skills that are required in order to be called an expert developer? What do I need from a DBA, right? All of that is being defined by the practice managers. And so when as a project manager, that I come from the vertical side, if I am a project manager, I come from the vertical and I collect all these people from different practices into my now task or my project right now. I have to adhere to I cannot expect them to develop in ways that are different. And if I do, sometimes I do, I need to go to the practice manager and align that, right? So there are certain rules that are set by the practices that maintain knowledge, professionalism, quality of work, etc. But then all of these practices coming together in the context of a project or of a task or of a flight, when there are decisions to be made, they are made by the manager.
And I can see when you've got your project manager working with your practice manager, it's a lot easier to align amongst those 2 or 4 or 6 people than the 150 individuals who are doing the work.
Yes, and it's also important to agree on most of those in advance. If you are, by the way, sometimes it will mean that the measurements or the goals of the practice managers and the project managers need to be taking into each other's goals. Because if I am the practice manager, I would want the project manager to commit to take a certain number of people and never deviate from that. Because I am responsible for the gross margin of the company as the practice manager. The project manager will want endless flexibility. Today I need the people, tomorrow I don't need the people because there is a delay, the customer didn't give me the requirement, suddenly the customer gave me more requirement. So I need from the practice endless flexibility. Now, neither of them are potentially possible. And so you have to align the goals of the two, of the matrix structure. So we have to align the goals, we have to align the best practices, we have to give the guidelines of what is allowed, what is not allowed, how, sometimes, even on HR topics, if I am the manager of the task and these guys are not my employees, I may be less sensitive to their needs, to their human needs. And so guidelines need to be put in place. So once you have a structure, that is a matrix structure. You align the goals. You align, by the way, the priorities. You create those best practices, and then you create the virtual structures that actually allow you to work in the most effective manner. So that's the second family, which is structures.
What's the third family?
The third family is flow. And I call it flow, but I think it's a good name. And here I go back to manufacturing. So what is the most known example of synchronization revolution? It's the Ford assembly line of black Model T, right? What did he do? He realized that just the fact that you have like 50, 70 people working together at the same time on building a car, it's a mess. Now, there is no reason for them to do that, because if you take the tasks and you dissect them into the atomic activities, right, and you just make sure that things are synchronized, people, at the moment they need to do something, it's there, right? And it's much easier to do it with a small piece of work than a very large piece of work. If I individually, I'm one person and I have one thing to do, like this, like in the movie of Charlie Chaplin, right? I can do that. There is no complexity here. But if I'm the guy that is strengthening the bolt and my wrenches are now busy with someone else, then I'm going to wait. So he created this amazing thing, which is called assembly line, which takes the work and turn it into a flow. In the software world, this is called agile. Agile is nothing but turning work, a project, into an assembly line. So the parts that are moving on the conveyor belt are features or user stories, like we call them in software development. And then they move from design, development, testing, production, design, development, testing, production. So you have a few machines. Each of them is processing a very small feature or a very small user story very quickly. And it's happening really, really fast. So whenever you are able to take a complicated project and break it into simple tasks, pile them together like inventory of material, and then start processing them in a conveyor belt, that is going to create a significant impact on your performance. It is going to have less synchronization issues because everything is more predictable. By the way, you're also not going to develop things that you don't need. You're going to start realizing value much quicker because you're going to start releasing things to production much faster. But again, it's not only in software development. In fact, software development is probably the last industry that adopted this concept. But there is one more thing that it allows you to do, and that is to apply lean principles to your assembly line. So what is lean? Lean is, again, it came from manufacturing, from Toyota. And it's actually a systemic way to reduce waste in an assembly line. And we don't need to go into all the secrets of lean.
So that could be a completely separate episode and conversation getting into, because it's thrown around a lot. Six Sigma, lean manufacturing.
Exactly. So we don't need to go into that. But when you apply the lean principle to your agile assembly line, what do you get? DevOps. DevOps is nothing but taking the project, breaking it into an assembly line, which is called agile, and then applying lean principles to get it more automated, faster, more autonomous, whatever. And then you get DevOps. And so when today you see modern development teams develop software, and you compare it to the original agile, it's really like seeing a modern manufacturing facility compared to the Ford manufacturing facility of the Model T, right? The first one was relatively manual and inefficient, and over 100 years, it became robots and everything is automatic. It's the same thing between development in Agile and development in DevOps.
And you've used a number of examples between hospital and manufacturing technology. You may think, well, professional services, where it's people. It's people dependent. That you're not going to be able to apply a lot of this. And where we see it is it's always difficult to hire someone who needs to be really good at three different things. It's really difficult to scale that way versus taking each of those three things and separating that out into three different people. And whether you
Yes.
start with that on a part-time basis, as you mentioned, skills required earlier, the practice managers are responsible for making sure they have the skills. It's easier to define those skills and to train those skills when you only need to define and train one skill for each group or each individual. And you've broken that. I need three people who can do three different things, or do I need three different people who can do one thing?
Yes. So resource management in services is a complicated task
Very.
because everyone depends on the resource managers. And I agree with you that it is easier to hire and train someone to build a few teams of speciality than a very large team that everyone should know everything. First, they will not, but also it will take you much, much longer to achieve that. But by the way, that's a great example of how to utilize what you just said to reduce dependency. So how do you reduce the dependency between the project managers that need people and the practice managers who are hiring people?
Mm-hmm.
You hold a buffer. You hold enough buffer of what we call bench that will allow you
Mm-hmm.
to immediately supply people to the projects, right? And then the trick in running a good practice is not to have a too big buffer, not too small buffer, and to use the buffer size as your cue, as your signal. Do I need to hire, or I need to move people to another place, right? Because the buffer is the thing that allows you to react immediately, decouple the dependency, and what you need to do is manage the buffer, right? So let's say that your goal is to as a practice manager, you need to maintain a certain profitability of the line, right? And at the same time, you also need to provide people in a flexible manner. So you always need to have like a minimum buffer, a maximum buffer, and manage within that. Now, how big is the buffer? The buffer depends on your ability to hire and train. The faster you can hire and train, the smaller the buffer can be. And then defining the skills into more atomic, trainable thing. If you can get someone in 2 weeks, that's great. If you need like 6 months now to get a person, you need a very big buffer.
There's a lot in those three groups between the mechanical, the structure, the flow. If I were to, as a leader, step back and say, I'm going to go on the process, that the problem here is not having the right people. The problem here is not the people, as you mentioned. It's the flows that they're in. It's the tasks that they're doing. It's how they're working. What would be kind of my first step in this process of evaluating that? Where would you advise I start?
Talk to the people, ask questions, and trust their, like, peel the frustrations. There are always frustrations, and ask questions that will get you to understand the bottlenecks. Where is the bottlenecks? And then take those simple concepts that we talked about and see how they work. Is there an alignment between accountability and authority? If no, you have a problem. If yes, move on. Are there dependencies that are causing people to wait? If no, great. If yes, we need to solve it, right? So ask the questions that will lead you to understand if the points that we talked about exist. And then try to assess what is the more easy thing to solve that has the greatest impact. And it's going to be different from each environment, right?
I know you've got a lot of tips for leaders that they can implement in a team environment to help the team be more successful, to the extent that you put them all down together in a book.
Yes. So, I wrote the book by mistake.
I
At
love it
some
when
point,
those happen. You just,
I really didn't mean to. I felt fortunate to work with in so many environments that are so, that taught me a lot. I was also fortunate to be tasked with implementing theory of constraints and lean and
Mhm.
then agile and dev. So I really got into it, and I saw how it actually works. And then at some point, I had it all in my head, but it wasn't written to me in a structured way, in a structured methodology. And I said to myself, you know what, why don't you write it down, just the points, so that it will sit better in your head. And I started, and from here to there, I wrote a book.
what what are some of your favorite ones that stand out? As I know they're very practical tips on in management practices of how you got to where you're at and what you've implemented. I'm sure there's a couple that you're just so passionate about, you love talking about.
Yeah, so a lot of them are just synchronization tips, just like the ones that I talked
Mhm.
about. But I think there are a couple of tips that I think really stand out. The first one is coach your team to assume decency. How many times, to me, it happened a lot. I'm sure that it might have happened to you as well, that someone bursts into your room or in your Zoom call and tells you, oh, I cannot deal with these people. They are so stupid. They don't care. If only this, if only that. Just like I used to be
Mhm.
before this guy entered into my room. And from that moment on, I never played this game. Whenever someone is from my team is trying to get me to help them fight the fight, I always push back. I say, look, it cannot be. What do you think? That when Joe comes to the office, he doesn't want to do a good job? Like he just wants to be an asshole? Sorry. I hope that it's okay. Pardon my French. It can't be. And I try to get them to talk.
Mhm.
Find out what is bothering Joe. And so that's a very, very strong tip. And it's remarkable in how many environments I needed to be very consistent in trying to get people to, because there is such a strong tendency to look for others to
Mhm.
blame, but it works. Eventually people get it, right? And they it also makes everything more pleasant in the environment of work.
Night and day difference, because I those conversations understanding each other don't need to be hurtful, hateful. The conflict that we dread walking into the office. And what you mentioned was you were pounding on the keyboard and responding via email versus the philosophy of eh, get out of your office, walk down to theirs, or if you're virtual, pick up the phone, no more than two emails, pick up the phone and have a conversation. I was taught such a poignant lesson of it's difficult to misinterpret someone or blame someone when you know them. You know what they do on the weekend, what they do for fun. You know what motivates them. Get to know them.
And be curious. Be curious. Why are you doing this? There has to be a reason, right? So that's number one. I think the other, kind of one or two tips that I really think are important are related to the fact that if you accept the fact that it's not the people, it's how they work, then you have to accept the fact that it's your responsibility. There is there is no claim that you can come to your team. It's all on you, the leader, and every one of us in our own leadership, great, right? If you're a team lead, it's on you. If you're a manager, it's on you that your team leads will be able to work in a synchronized manner. And if you're the CEO, it's on you. It's your responsibility that everyone will work in a synchronized manner. And so the tip is really, really simple. Own synchronization. Synchronize, right? Just remember that you cannot delegate that. You cannot. Only you who sees the full picture can actually cause the teams to be synchronized. And the higher up you are in the hierarchy, the more responsibility you have and the more impact you will have by synchronizing everyone. I mean, you can get consultants, you can get experts that will help you, etc., but it's your responsibility. And therefore, you have nothing to complain about your people. You can complain about yourself, not about the people.
So when you're stepping into an organization to help with synchronization, usually they're not saying, I got a synchronization issue. That usually ends up being the solution to it. What are some of the pains that they're going through? They're picking up and saying, I've got these issues. I need you to come help me solve them.
So typically it's a business performance problem. It will be either, I can't deliver what I'm supposed to deliver, or, I can't make my profit that I'm expected to make, or, so it's typically either I cannot deliver what I can sell, or my growth is in trouble, or my quality is bad, or I'm selling but then it's a nightmare and customers are walking away, and that's I think is something that you will see in almost any large company. There will be those environments where are struggling to be able to meet their commitments. Now, sometimes there is a product fit issue. It's not the answer to all the business problems that people have. But if you have a decent product that has or offering or a service, right? If you know that you've been able to do it in the past and the market is there, and still you cannot deliver, then you probably have a synchronization problem.
Thank you so much, Yoav. And I appreciate your coming at it from the perspective when you step in and help organizations. You're not taking over and saying, I'm going to fix this problem. You're looking at the leadership saying, I'm going to help you own this. And you're helping them figure out who needs to own it. How do we need to structure that individual to own it? And then I can help that individual figure out how to resolve and get synchronization of that.
Because most of the time it was me. Most of the time it was me. I needed to do it to my own organization, so I know where they're coming from.
Speaking at it firsthand. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your career. And I would encourage anyone to do exactly what you did, which was, I've got all of these decades of experience and all these lessons. We shouldn't just be documenting our SOPs, documenting inside the organization. Let's document how we're approaching it as leaders. Let's write down what's our secret sauce and how we're making that impact and how we're able to achieve success. Thank you very much for your insights and for joining me today on Cerius Leadership.
Thank you for having me.